Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It sounds like you've got a good lineup of Libermans, so glad to be the first here and kick it off for you. So yeah, I'm in the psychology department at UCSB, so I drove down this morning. Lovely campus. Had some good meetings so far and excited to continue talking to you. So yes, this is the title of my talk today. I'm going to be telling you about some research that I've done on how infants think about similarity. And then at the end, I'll get into some newer work on kids as well and sort of why I'm interested in these questions. So this idea that birds of a feather flock together, you've probably heard before. You can see it if you look at this group of flamingos, but people don't actually mean birds when they say this. They of course mean people instead, right? A general notion of homophily or similarity as guiding social structure. And this is not a new idea, as you probably know, so it's been around for basically as long as academics have been around. So both Plato and Aristotle have had some version of this throughout their writing. So similarity begets liking, people who are the same might be friends, or people love those who are like themselves. And so this seems like maybe some truism if we've been talking about it for this long. Maybe there's something to this idea. It's also foundational to research in the social sciences in general. So if you look back to social network studies from the 1920s to the 1950s, and people looking at things like how do others make decisions about where they live or who to be friends with in their school, things like that, you find pretty broadly that similarity matters. So this social network graph is an example of that. So this is from the ad health data. I don't know how many of you know about this data set, but it's a large nationally representative data set. And so this is high school kids from one school. And so each dot is a child in the school. And they're separated or colored based on the race or ethnicity of that child. So like the white kids are in yellow and the black kids are in green and the Asian kids are red. And so what you can see is basically how close people are together. So if people say that they're very close to somebody, then their two dots end up closer together. And if they're not so close, they end up farther apart. And the lines are like listed as, who are your 5 closest connections. And so you can see pretty much that there are like these 4 groups, and there are some connections between them, but like there's these clusters, right? And that there looks like, in this case at least, there's something about race or ethnicity that matters. Not that it's the whole thing, right? You end up with 2 separate groups of black students, so it's not like completely divided. And there's obviously some little bits of overlap, like this student here or here, but you get the picture. There's something about similarity. This isn't random. And so then the kinds of questions that I'm interested in are getting more specific into this. So if we have this idea, and we've had it for a very long time, that there's something about similarity that structures how people act and interact, what is it that we're actually talking about? There's like many, many kinds of similarity. So these are just a few dimensions that people have considered. This is like a famous sociology paper. So the graph I showed you is about race or ethnicity, but there's all sorts of other things like political values or language or things like aspiration. So how much do you value seeking higher education? And so all of these dimensions of similarity have been shown to matter in some ways for thinking about who's going to connect and interact with each other. So that's one kind of big question, is what kind of similarity are we talking about? And another kind of big question is what kind of relationship are we talking about? So similarity connects to relationships. What kind of similarity? And what kind of relationships? And so this is another one that people have found really broad influences of similarity. So from relationships where you do have this really close interpersonal connection, so like friendships or people who get married, there tends to be a lot of similarities in demographic features among married couples. But it also shows up in sort of more relationships that are just about actual social interaction. So who do you seek as a mentor at work? Like who would you want to share a secret with or trust? People tend to want to interact with people who they're similar to. It also shows up, though, in contexts that are seemingly more random, like who you might end up standing next to on a bus. So these 2 people that have a penchant for chunky oatmeal-colored sweaters have ended up on this bus next to each other, and there's nothing really, maybe the oatmeal chunky sweater is like a proxy for some kind of deeper value system of like sustainable clothing, or, it's hard to say, but in general, across the social sciences, people talk about these things so broadly. It can basically be any kind of similarity And it can be like any kind of relationship, and if you look at it, you'll probably find some kind of significant connection or correlation. So I'm basically interested in why that is, or what it is that we're actually tracking and how. And I do that by studying people who look like this, so infants and sometimes young children. And the reason that I think that this is a particularly interesting population is that when you look at a baby, they kind of look like a blob who can't necessarily do that much of anything. And so they have to learn everything. And so it's interesting to think about what kinds of structures are built in that help guide that learning. And what is it that's easy to learn? So if you actually have this broad thing, like any kind of similarity should be connected to any kind of social relationship, then maybe what the baby is doing is just forming associations in their world and picking up on all sorts of similarities and then just linking things that look the same or feel the same or sound the same, go together, and things that are different don't, in a really broad way. But if you take an evolutionary perspective, which many people in this room likely do, given the audience, you might think that that would not be the way that the mind is sort of built to be structured. And so I sort of usually fall on that side of the coin too. And so then the question becomes, what kinds of similarities is the mind paying attention to really early on before we get a lot of input? And what does it use those similarities to do? And so that's basically what I'll be talking about today. This talk has 3 main parts, and they get more speculative with time. They also get shorter. So if we're still in part 1 and you're like, how is this possible? It's because basically all of the data is in part 1. And in part 1, I'll just go over a few studies that I've done that are all in this line of work and try to convince you that infants are seeing similarity in some ways and using it to guide their inferences about who's going to interact with each other. So that's based on some data. And then in part 2, I'll suggest that some kinds of similarity might be more relevant early on and that we might be sort of ready to pay attention to them as infants. And that is more speculative. And maybe you can help me at the end during the question and discussion section figure out some of the better ways to test some of these ideas. But I'll give you some preliminary theorizing. And then at the end, I'm going to suggest that, which might not be shocking to you, that actually different types of similarities are going to be the most relevant for reasoning about different types of relationships. So if you want to know which people are friends, there might be certain similarities you should pay attention to. If you want to know which people are from the same country or which people are siblings, you might pay attention to different kinds of similarity, right? So maybe similarity has broad implications, but is also more specific in some ways. Okay. Great. So how most of these studies are going to work is the same, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the method, and then I'll show all of the data together. So basically what I do is violation of expectation looking time studies with babies. So you have a baby, and you put them in a high chair. In my case, this is a picture of a baby in a high chair, and what you see in the corner, which you'll see a more prolonged example of later, is what the baby sees. So the baby is sitting in a high chair, watching a movie, and we're filming the baby's face. And so then what you're doing is measuring attention. And so we know from a few decades of research now that babies tend to look longer at things that they find relatively more surprising or unexpected. And so we measure infant attention to different kinds of movies that vary only minimally and ask which ones they look longer at, suggesting they think that those are more surprising. And so in this set of studies, what we did is we showed babies in familiarization to people, to women in all of our cases, though they wouldn't have to be. And those people were either the same as each other in some way or different from one another. And so that was randomly assigned. So half of the babies saw 2 similar women and half saw 2 dissimilar. And then afterwards, they all saw the same kinds of test trials. So they got to see those 2 women that they saw at the beginning interact with each other. And so sometimes they'll interact like they're friends. You'll see what that looks like. And then other times they'll interact like they're not friends. And so we can measure infant attention and see, do they think that these 2 people that they saw before are more likely to interact like friends or like non-friends. Okay. And so we did a few versions of this that I'll preview all at once. In one, we looked at the similarity being in terms of preference, and in particular in terms of food preferences. So babies saw 2 people eating foods, and half of the babies saw them like the same food. So for example, 2 women both liked the food in the purple cup. And half of the babies saw them liking opposite foods. So if one woman disliked the food in the purple cup, the other woman liked it. I'll show you videos of what it looks like because they're pretty hilarious. And then afterwards, we showed those same two women interacting like they're friends by smiling and waving at one another, or like they aren't friends by turning away from each other. So for this first example, I'll show you the movies and then I'll tell you what's different about the other studies. So they look like this.
Ooh, I like that. Ooh, I like that. Ew, I don't like that. Ew, I don't like that.
It's very fun to play these movies and watch people watching them. Their faces sort of mimic the whole thing. They're like, oh, yeah, I understand why you don't like it. But so there you saw basically the two women agree in both what they like and what they dislike. And so half of the babies would see something like that, and the other half would see that they have different preferences. So for example, the one in the orange might like the food in the purple cup, but not the other one, and the one in the blue would like the food in the green bowl, etc. And we did that so that we equate all of the positive and negative expressions that the babies hear. It's just that the order of who's doing what varies, which could be important. And if you have questions about sort of infant methods later, we can get into why that might be important. But that's what that looks like. And then the people interact with one another, either like they're friends. Hi! That's how I'm sure you all interact with your friends. Very normal. Or like they are not friends. And so then we time infant looking to the still screens like this. So the two test movies are the same length of time and the people are the same distance from each other. And we're looking at how long after this event ends are infants still interested in looking at the screen, which suggests that they're processing that information. And so just because this is the first looking time study I'll talk about, it's like you could imagine that if you saw a magic trick, you might want to see the magic trick a second time or in slow motion to figure out where the sleight of hand was. But if you see me drink water from this cup, you don't need to see it a second time or in slow motion because it makes sense. And so adults' reaction time or processing time differs too based on how surprising events are. But because infants in general process things slower, you can see it on the order of something more like seconds rather than milliseconds. And so we measure attention to these two types of movies and see which one they stare at, like, wait, what's that? And which one they're more likely to look away at something more exciting, like their toes, for example. Babies like their toes. Okay. So that's what the food preference version looked like. And then we also did a study that asked the same kind of question about the role of similarity, but instead of asking about food, we asked about language. So we showed the infants that there were two actors who either spoke the same language, like two English speakers, so ones who spoke the language that's around them in their community, or that they spoke different languages. And we used bilingual actresses so that we could counterbalance who was the English or Spanish speaker, so it could be nothing about the person that was driving the effect. And so then afterwards they would get to see these people also interact like they're friends or like they're not friends. We also did a version that, ritual might be seemingly a strong term for it, but you'll see that where people do an action that has all of the properties that a ritual might have. So they either do the same action. Some of you may have seen things with this light box kind of before. And so the person reaches for a toy and brings it towards her, and her hands are free. She could use her hand to turn it on, but she decides instead to use her head. And so this is like a causally irrelevant action. And so a baby might learn from this something like, oh, this is how you should do it. Because if you could or should do it this easier way, you would, but you aren't. So anyway, so they do the same action that has these properties of ritual, or they do two different actions to reach the same goal. So sometimes the same action was that they both used their elbow, and sometimes it was head, and then the different action was that one used her head to turn it on and one used her elbow. Okay. And then the same type of test trials here. All right, so all of the results together, I'll orient you to this graph. Basically what you see on the y-axis is the amount of time that infants spent looking at the still screen of the two types of test trials. And if you remember that I've been saying that longer looking tends to indicate something surprising or unexpected. And so what you see here is that in general, the red bars, which indicate when the people disengage or act like they're not friends, are higher than the blue bars, regardless of the type of similarity, suggesting that babies think that when two people who are similar to each other are going to interact, they're going to be maybe more likely to affiliate and smile and wave at each other. And that it's surprising if they don't do that. And so then in the other cases with dissimilarity, you see that you get the opposite pattern, and if anything, stronger. And so this suggests that there's nothing about, you might think from the previous graph, oh, babies tend to just see people smile and wave at each other more, so it's just surprising if anyone acts like they're not friends, like that's weird. But it seems like actually they are using the information about similarity and dissimilarity in some way, because their reaction to these test trials is different. And so what actually matters most is the interaction in all of the cases, but this is sort of an easier way to present all of the data together. So there are significant effects here, but really it's that they differ based on the type of similarity or dissimilarity that you found. Okay, so yeah. Yeah.
In the language one, when they use express,
Mm-hmm.
they say hi.
That's a great question. They do neither. We actually pilot tested with a bunch of adult but native English Spanish speakers multiple sounds to see what would sound positive and plausible in both languages. And so we ended up with, when they turn towards each other, they say, hey. It's kind of like Canada, but like it's the sound that exists in both language and is positive, and they still smile and wave. But yeah, they don't say hi because that would be weird. Then you've shown that the Spanish speaker is speaking English. So yeah, good catch there. They still say humph because that's not linguistically specific. Okay, great. So we also asked sort of the opposite question, which is, do infants use relationships to make inferences about people's traits, or whether they're going to be similar to each other or not? So you can imagine if you're a baby or even an adult human and you're out in the world and you're looking and you're trying to figure out what's going on, sometimes you might get information about similarity. Like if you're at a restaurant, you might see which foods did people order, who's eating together, are they expressing the same kinds of things, are people reacting the same way? But a lot of times what you're actually going to get is information about relationships. So you're going to see two people who, smile at each other or hug or do something that suggests that they're friends, or something that, suggests caretaking in some way. And so we asked whether babies can also use that kind of information, seeing the type of relationship that people are engaged in, to make an inference about similarity or not. So the same exact type of study, but just flipped the order. In fact, we used the same exact videos, so I won't show them again. Basically, we just instead started with these relationships, so infants were randomly assigned this time to see just one of these types of things, so either two people who are friends or two people who are not friends. And then they got to see one person's preference. So like the person in blue liked the food in the green bowl, and we asked, what do they think that second person will do? Will she agree or will she disagree? And so how we did that was that we presented babies with test trials where the second person sometimes actively disagreed. So she disliked the food that the other person had liked, and sometimes she also provided a dislike expression, but towards the other bowl. So we did this to equate the emotion in the second type of test trials, so that because babies can tell the difference between positive and negative. So if they think that it's surprising for people to disagree, then they should look longer at this type of movie, even though it's actually in some ways more similar to what they've been seeing, which is somebody interact with the green bowl. So in infancy work, a lot of people think that effects could be driven by perceptual differences, right? So if you're looking longer at things that are new or surprising, then the more things that are new or surprising should mean that you're likely to look longer at it. And so here, this is the first time that anyone's ever interacted with this purple cup. And so the purple cup is new, the emotion is new because she's negative, the person is new because it's not the other girl. So if what you're only paying attention to is these kind of low-level features of newness, you would look longer at this type of test trial. But if disagreement is even more surprising than that, then you could override that perceptual kind of expectation and look longer here, even though less stuff is new. Okay. And then we did, again, the same kind of thing, except for that we showed one person liking something and asked if they thought the second person would disagree or dislike the new food. But we varied whether the two people spoke the same language, either the language that babies were generally familiar with, English, or an unfamiliar language, Spanish, or that they spoke two different languages. So one spoke English and one spoke Spanish. Okay. All right. Cool. So again, looking time is on the y-axis. Higher means more surprising. And what we found here was that when people either interacted like they were friends or spoke the same language, regardless of whether that was the infants, the language that's in their community, or a different language, but the same as each other, they expected the people to like the same foods. So they looked longer, suggesting they found it unexpected when that active disagreement occurred, even though it's more perceptually similar. However, this isn't just because they always think that people like the same foods or they've learned something, like that's the food that's good. When the people interacted like they weren't friends or spoke different languages, infants showed the opposite pattern, which could either be due to expecting these kinds of people to be really different or could be due to perceptual novelty. And I won't make a strong claim there. All right. So, part one, hopefully you're somewhat convinced at least, that infants expect affiliation between people who either interact in ways that suggest that they like the same foods, speak the same language, or perform the same sorts of ritualistic actions. And they expect people who either act like they're friends or like they're from the same group to also share properties. So there's this sort of bi-directional link between similarity, at least in terms of food preference that I've been talking about, or language, and how people are socially connected. Okay, so there's that. Do we have any questions on that before we move on? Okay, great. So now for the somewhat more speculative piece. So the similarities that I've been looking at so far, so things like speaking the same language or eating the same foods, are what some of you in the room might agree would be evolutionarily relevant similarities. So take language, for example. Language is an honest, language and accent even, so not just language, are honest markers of our social groups and where you're from. And so here you may know the Shibboleth story of trying to cross the bridge, and if you can't say Shibboleth correctly, they'll know that you're not from the right tribe, and so then you get killed. And so you can't fake it, so you have to learn the language that you're going to speak early, and if you don't learn it early enough in the critical period, you're going to have an accent. So it's this true identity marker of your group, right? And so you can also, within America, there's many different kinds of accents. You can debate whether you agree or disagree with which ones are the worst here. But I don't know if any of you have taken the Harvard survey. There's like a survey, there's like a short version on the New York Times where you basically answer 20 questions like how many, okay, if you have the word capital M-A-R-Y, or the word lowercase M-E-R-R-Y, or M-A-R-R-Y, do those have one sound, two sounds, or three sounds? Does anyone want to? We had a three? Three? Can you say them?
Mary, and Mary.
Yeah, like to me they're all Mary. So I mean, like, I don't know, I think it's one. But so they have like 20 questions like that are kind of hilarious, or like what do you call it when it's raining and the sun is out? My answer was like, I don't have a word for that. But apparently some people call it like the devil's beating his wife, or so, it's like some weird thing. The most common one is sun shower, but there's all these things. And so if you take this like just very short quiz, then they'll tell you where you're from basically. And so I was very strongly pinpointed to my hometown of St. Louis, and it's a pretty fun survey. But there's something about the way we speak, the words we use, our accent, all of these kinds of things that that say something really about identity, right? And so this might be a really important type of similarity that we've had throughout our history and that continues to mark like really critical and small differences between people. I'd argue that food preferences kind of work in the same way. So, you know, we do live in a globalized society now, and so you can eat all sorts of foods and you might really like them. But even if you're super into Indian food, you probably don't know how to make like chicken tikka masala that like tastes good, like at least without using a canned sauce, or how to like properly make a tortilla. And so different people around the world eat different kinds of things, and it's not based at least only on availability and edibility. Even if something is in your vicinity and you could technically eat it, a lot of people wouldn't. So like the gruesome example is like in the US we like don't eat dog, and like it's not that it's not here, it's not that you couldn't, but like it sounds horrifying. And so, but it's not true everywhere. Some people think cheese sounds horrifying. And also even smaller differences exist. So just like it's not just language, it's also accent. There are things that you can eat, but that you can't eat all the time, right? So within religion, different religious groups prohibit different kinds of things. Like on Fridays you have to eat fish, or during these 8 days you can't eat any leavened product, right? So these kinds of, and they're the sorts of things that you wouldn't know unless you're a member of that group. Like I actually can never remember if it's that you have to eat fish or you can't eat fish. Don't know. but knowing would maybe signal that I was part of that group, right? So, all right, and rituals work in the same kind of way too, right? They're not really about completing an action. By doing them and engaging with the group, you're suggesting that you're part of something, or that you have that knowledge that's required to be sort of in the group. So, I mean, this is like some soccer team, I don't know who they are, I can't ever remember, but like the rugby, it's a sport, yeah, they're like a sporting group, and they do like this like dance thing together, and then they look, more formidable, and also like a big, like a group, but like they all know it, and I don't know it, right? Or like religious people, like anyone can light candles, but knowing when you're supposed to light them, the order that you light these candles in, all of those kinds of things are something that we do because of our identities. And so maybe these kinds of similarities that so far my research has focused on are particularly relevant markers of group identity. And so maybe those are the ones, so I show infants can pay attention to similarity, they pay attention to these ones. So one question kind of becomes, do they have a really broad notion? Would they pay attention to any kind of similarity, or do they only pay attention to ones that maybe are important for marking group membership across human history? So I haven't personally done any work on this, and I mean, I probably should, but I think it's hard because you don't really want to do a project where you're expecting to find a null result, like, oh, babies don't care that people who wear green shirts act in one way or don't, right? And then it's like, well, maybe they just weren't paying attention, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I don't have great evidence, but I'll show you some evidence from other people that I think is suggestive of the fact that this might be true. So there is some evidence that in their own preferences of who infants want to approach and interact with themselves, that they cared about different kinds of similarity differently. So what they did in these kinds of studies is basically they introduced infants to 2 puppets, and they show them something about each puppet, and then they put the puppets forward, and babies get to choose which puppet they want to play with. So sometimes they looked at the same kind of similarity I looked at, like food preferences, which looks like this. Basically, there's these 2 puppets. One of them likes graham crackers.
Yum. I like graham crackers. Hi. Ew, yuck. I don't like green beans.
The other one likes green beans.
Yum. I like green beans. Hi. Ew, yuck. I don't like graham crackers.
Okay, so before watching those puppets interact like that, the baby has gotten to choose between the 2 foods and eat the one that they like. And then after watching the puppets eat the foods, the babies get to choose which puppet they want to play with. And so what they find is that babies tend to choose the one who's similar to themselves. So if they liked the graham crackers, which is most of the babies, they're more likely to reach for the puppet who liked the graham crackers. There are some babies who prefer green beans. Those ones are more likely to reach towards the puppet who liked green beans. But this doesn't always happen. So in another condition, the babies were shown that these 2 puppets varied in which color mittens they were given. So one puppet is given orange mittens and the other one is given yellow mittens, and the baby is given a set of mittens too, either orange or yellow, and then they get to pick a puppet. So they're similar to one, they're wearing the same color mittens, but they didn't choose it and it's mittens. And in that case, they don't show any kind of differentiation in their own choices of who to pick to play with. So this is suggestive that at least it's not paying attention to any kind of low-level similarity. It's, not perfect because maybe if they had chosen the mittens, you would find something that's conflating multiple variables, but, suggestive. There's the same kind of evidence with older kids. Don't really have to go into it that much, but basically being above the dotted line means above chance at choosing the similar. So if the kind of thing that is being similar is food preference or toy preference or appearance, then children pick to play with a puppet who's similar to them. But if it's that they're randomly assigned an arbitrary sticker or that they're wearing the same color t-shirt, then kids are at chance at who they want to be friends with. So maybe not all similarity is really completely equal. The closest thing that I have in my own research comes from a condition of that study asking whether infants generalize preferences across people. So if you show babies that two people are friends, they think that they should like the same foods. But if you show babies two people are friends, they don't think they necessarily need to like the same objects, even if those objects are the exact same thing. So instead of eating a food from the bowl, once they bring it towards them, they lift up the bowl and they expect it, and they're like, ooh, I like this bowl, And so this suggests that maybe there's something special about food, right? But again, not perfect evidence. Also in the research that I did on ritual, we found that it's not that infants think that people who are dissimilar in any way won't affiliate. So we had another study that was based on this principle from, which you may have all seen in this science paper, where basically babies see somebody turn on this light by using this weird action in their head. And when they see that and the person could have used her hands, like they're on the table and she intentionally chooses to use her head, if you give babies the light, they'll turn it on with their head, suggesting that they think, this is how we should do this, or that they've learned that that's how the light works. But if you show the same exact thing, the woman turns on the light using her head, but you also show that she's really cold, and so she's like wearing this blanket and shivering, and so her hands aren't accessible, then if you give babies the light, they'll turn it on, but with their hand. So they use like the more rational, direct kind of action. And so even though in both cases they've seen the same evidence, which is using head to turn on light, they interpret it differently. And so we designed a study that used the same exact principles. So basically infants saw one person turn on the light with her head and one person turn it on with her hand, but the person turning it on with her head was either could have chosen to do the normal thing and use her hand, or couldn't because she was wearing the blanket and was very cold. And here babies thought that these people would not be friends, so similar to what we saw before, they're doing something different, so maybe they won't interact with each other positively, but that these people could. So they kind of have the same goal, they both want to turn on the light, and they're doing it in any way that they can figure out how to do it. Okay. Great, so a little bit more speculative, but maybe not all similarity is completely equal for infants and young children. And there might be some similarities that are evolutionarily relevant or that have marked human social groups for a long time, like how we speak or like what we eat, that are particularly important that infants pay attention to, more so than other kinds of similarity, like what are you assigned to wear, or what bowl do you like. But yeah, there's a lot of open questions here. For example, what are the boundary conditions on this? So what makes a similarity evolutionarily relevant versus not? What is the developmental trajectory of this? We know that adults can pay attention to all sorts of similarities. So in social psychology, for instance, people care about minimal groups. So things like being assigned to wear the same shirt color as somebody else, or like being told that you're an overestimator or underestimator. So clearly, eventually, like people in some ways, though probably not as deeply, care about other kinds of similarities. So when and how does that happen? And how do different experiences or different cultures impact this? So your culture might be like a good cue to you of which similarities are important there. And so they might be different depending on your different experiences. Okay. Sort of green checkbox there. So now I'll dive into this idea that maybe different kinds of similarity are important when you're thinking about different kinds of relationships. So far I've been focusing mostly on friendship, but people obviously engage in a lot of different kinds of social relationships. And so, for example, what you see here is this list that I brought up at the beginning of class that people in the social sciences generally have found are relevant for thinking about connections. And so then now what's going to happen is that I'm going to color code this list in like a scale of blue, like dark being probably really important according to my lay view, and light being less so important for different kinds of relationships. So if you're asking yourself, are these two people from the same national group, from the same place? Some of these similarities might matter and others might matter less. So for example, things like what language do they speak or what religion are they are a lot of times guided by where you're from or your group memberships. Those get dark blue, but other kinds of things aren't that relevant, like gender. In fact, I mean, there's nothing about, it would be weird for a national group to have only one gender, right? So, and then some things might fall kind of more in the middle, like your values are probably driven partly by where you're from, but you also have different ones than other people. Like if you look at the US, and the political spectrum, there's kind of a big divide there. But we still all might be more similar than people from somewhere totally else. So, whereas if you're talking about friendship, a whole different group of these might show up as most important. So here it could be that these ones on the left that are more about demographic characteristics of the person are probably like usually pretty important, at least for like initial connections. But the things on the right, which are more about things that exist in your mind, might be even more important, since if you want to have these conversations and build your relationship and intimacy, you might want to talk about your own values. Whereas if you're talking about sibling, you could again get a different kind of structure where here again, gender would not be relevant. Age is relevant to an extent, right? So if somebody is a very different age from you, they're probably not that likely to be your sibling. But like them being the exact same age as you is also pretty unlikely. Like I have a twin, so I do have a sibling who's the exact same age as me, but in the vast majority of cases, that's not the best cue, right? So, okay. So in one study, I started asking whether kids are paying attention to this, whether they're using different kinds of relationships to reason about different kinds of similarity. And so what we did was that we showed kids a picture like this. So 3 kids, they were gender matched. So this is like an example of what a girl would see. And we told them about this top child's relationship to 2 other kids. So one of them we said was her friend, and the other one we said shared a different type of relationship with her. Either they went to school together, they were siblings, or they were from the same national group, a made-up one, a place called Cortania. And and we varied, which kid was on which side, etc. And then we told them that the top kid had some knowledge or some pieces of information. So, for example, in the moral case, it was, this girl knows that hitting people is wrong. And then we asked, who else knows that hitting people is wrong? This girl, or both these girls. And then we also told them about a different kind of information, which you would acquire in a different way, right? So her secret, so this girl has a secret. Who else knows her secret? This girl, or both these girls. And then we told them about something conventional. So this girl knows how to celebrate Festivus. Who else knows how to celebrate Festivus? This girl, or both these girls. Then we asked, do you know what Festivus is? Kids say they do, but they don't actually. Parents usually do. They were like, you get the pole out. Anyway, so who else knows? And so the question is, do kids generalize the knowledge or information that one person has differently to these other people based on social relationships? And so what you'll see here is this graph has the proportion of kids saying, yes, this other girl knows. And so for each of the different kinds of relationships. So in terms of this girl knows that hitting people is wrong, who else knows it? Kids generalize that knowledge regardless of the type of relationship, since moral violations maybe apply to everyone. So they think that her friend would know that hitting people is wrong, her sibling that may be slightly less so, could be, something happening at home there, but above chance, and that the person from her group and the person that she just randomly goes to school with all know that hitting people is wrong. But it's not just that they think that everybody knows everything. Kids are pretty bad at source monitoring, so you could think, oh, they know it, so they just think everyone else knows it. But that's not really the case. If you ask about a secret, they understand that there's something about social closeness. So the people that you would actually interact with a lot are likely to know your secrets. So people who are like your friends or your siblings, you might be at home together and tell them stuff. But other people probably don't know it. So someone that you just randomly go to school with and sit next to, or somebody who's from the same place as you, but you may or may not even know, those people probably don't know your secrets. And again, so for the conventional case, so who knows how to celebrate Festivus, kids thought that your sibling or somebody from your national group would be the people who would be most likely to know that, which makes sense. Your sibling is probably in the same culture or the same religion or the same thing as you, as are the people who are from around you. But just because you're friends with somebody doesn't mean they necessarily know that. So kids were at chance at these other two relationships. Okay. Great. So this is some initial evidence that there might be different kinds of similarity that are most important when you're thinking about different kinds of social relationships. Some types of knowledge you gain from actually interacting one-on-one with other people, so something like someone's secret, and so therefore the relationships of people who would know that are people that you actually interact one-on-one with. Other kinds of knowledge you gain in other ways, so things like how to do cultural things or celebrate a holiday. You probably do learn them from other people, like your parents or something like that, but there's like a lot of other people in the world who you don't know who also engage in those cultural practices too. Okay. And there's a lot of interesting open questions, like do infants do these kinds of things? So infants can reason about all sorts of relationships. So I showed mostly studies about affiliation, but a lot of other people study things like thinking about dominance or kinship. And so you could ask what kinds of similarities drive these inferences as well earlier in development. Okay, so thanks to everyone who helped with this research, funding, et cetera, and to you guys for watching this talk. And I'm excited to hear questions and ideas.
Thank you. This was an interesting talk. I was wondering if you thought about, I mean, you were kind of saying this, but I guess I just want to push this one little point a little bit, and that is there are certain kinds of similarity that can be learned more easily than others. And within the domain of language, you can imagine a situation where you can learn syntax and grammatical stuff in the language and actually speak fluently, but you can't lose the accent. Right? I mean, I know plenty of people who have been speaking English for a long time. My mother's speaks English for 65 years. She still has an accent.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, going by the logic you're laying out, looking at those things that are really hard to acquire versus things like food preferences, which I could learn to like the food in any culture and be convincing that I really like it and I understand the rules, and I could learn that stuff, but I might never get the accent right.
Yeah, maybe. I actually think that there's some pretty interesting research that was not done in the psychology world at all, but there might be something about taste that also has some kind of critical period. So basically there was some studies that people were doing to ask about whether you could get members of the military to like the local cuisine, because it would be a lot easier, right, if the soldiers go off to war and they eat the stuff that's there and you don't have to send them stuff from the US. And I mean, it turns out that it doesn't work perfectly, right? So maybe it is actually, we don't maybe know the dimensions in the same way that we understand what syntax is and what prosody is and what sounding native is. So I don't know how you would divide the food world, but I think that it's possible that yeah, you can learn some things and maybe, and you can like things that you didn't have earlier on, but things also do have a weird taste, and maybe you can learn to, I don't know what the measure, I don't know how you would ask that, but it's plausible to me that food actually works in the same way as language in that, and that might be why. And rituals too, maybe you can kind of learn how to do them, but in a maybe not as fluent or fluid of a way, and if you were parsing it at some other millisecond level, or okay, so I mean, I'm an atheist, but I grew up Jewish, and so then I you go to synagogue, and so now I know all of this stuff. And I just have this weird knowledge of it, how to do it, when you sit, when you stand, when you bow, all this kind of stuff that I don't use at all, right? But I learned it young, and then people convert, and they try to learn, and some people get really, really into it, but I don't know that it ever feels the same way. I'm just there, and I'm just doing all the weird stuff. I don't even know, I don't know why it is, or I don't care about it in any particular way, but learning something young might be important.
Because I'm thinking it's really about whether you can trick other people.
Yeah.
Right? And so there are many different ways you could do that without actually having that internal feeling. But you're right, maybe you'll always be more convincing in that ritual than any person who's tried to learn it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do think that's interesting though, because the whole thing probably is signaling, right? At least in the ritual case, but probably in the food case too. That's why it's the rudest thing ever to like go to somebody's house and they've made you dinner and like to say you don't like it, right? It's like you choke it down, like you just
Smile,
do.
yeah.
You're like, thank you so much for this lovely borscht, like whatever, pink face. So because it's really rude not to, so, but are you convincing at that, right? Like I guess that is a really interesting question. I have also become interested in the food line and how infants are making choices themselves, because this obviously has like a lot of implications for things like obesity in our society. And so the big thing that people do, and that my research would maybe suggest that you should do if you're a parent, right, is if you're trying to get your baby to like a food, is that you eat it and you say like, really good. But I don't know if any of you have ever had baby food. It's from a can, but it's bad. Like it's bad. It doesn't taste good. Like, and some people make their baby their own food or whatever, and maybe that does taste good. But I almost wonder if like one reason why it's hard to get babies to eat those vegetables is even when parents are doing that, the babies aren't convinced. Like their face is probably like, like it doesn't taste good. So who knows? Yeah.
So just following up this thread, it seems to me one wants to be systematic about the a priori criteria for the expectation of. So I mean, many of your intuitions are interesting and plausible, but you want logical grounds for an assessment of when you expect similarity to matter. So with regard to the culturally evolved signals of membership in a cultural group, you can expect there to be a trade-off between broadcast efficiency and honesty, right? So with language perhaps being the one exception where that trade-off is muted, where you can have pretty high on both criteria. So something like adornment or style of dress, that has very high broadcast efficiency, right? You can detect a co-ethne from a great distance away just on the basis of the way they wear their toga or whatever it is, right? But it's easily faked, right? That is, someone can adopt those practices. Some more detailed esoteric knowledge, like the details of a ritual, for example, people can't walk around all the time broadcasting their expertise in the esoteric knowledge. But when you really need to know who is a member, then you can get it. So this is where language has unique affordances, because there's pretty good broadcast efficiency.
You're using it all the time.
From a reasonable distance, not a great distance, right? Versus say just visual signs. And it's very honest in the sense that it's hard to fake. But then you want to distinguish. I mean, I share your intuitions with regard to, say, some critical window in the development of what you might call something like cuisine expertise, not just preferences, because obviously people learn to like
like
foods
how
from a
you
variety
make
of
this,
cultures.
who's allowed to eat it.
Right, exactly all the details of what goes with what. I'm sure, the vast majority of us having the Persian food for lunch did it wrong, right? That means, we hit the wrong proportions or we put the wrong sauce on something. Right? But my suspicion is that the acquisition of dietary preferences is not a signal at all. It's an evolved system for a generalist where you need to know what is good to eat in a local ecology. And so, choking down the borscht is not a signal. That is, it's not that you're failing to signal or that the person who really likes the borscht is signaling. It's just a consequence of a system that is there for an entirely different purpose, which is learning the culturally necessary but not communicative components. Because if you think about it, food preferences are a crappy signal, right? You can't, I can see from a distance how you dress. When we get close, I can listen to how you speak. I don't know what you like, right?
The interactions, though, maybe more so like, I can't remember the details of like the lore, but it was something like, the queen is hosting dinner and there's like a little bowl and you're supposed to wash your fingers in it or something and the person drinks from it.
Right, but now you're in the realm of ritual, right? The esoteric knowledge.
Right, maybe a lot of rituals are around food, though too.
Sure, but that's different than dietary preferences, right? So, if you grow up eating kale and you like kale or whatever, that's just because we have a generalist psychology that says learn what is good to eat here. I don't think there's a signal component at all because it's a pretty poor signal. You have to watch pretty carefully to see what exactly people are eating and what they're, taking less of or something.
Yeah, it's true. I wonder if there would be a way to look at whether it's easier to learn like new kinds of object preferences or like preference of like which tool to use if two both accomplish the same task than it is to learn a new food preference later. I mean, maybe that's just because of the safety component of eating the wrong, like early developed, preferences based on looking for what's safe.
I guess backing up what I'm suggesting is that as you move forward with this very impressive research agenda, when you think about what should be easily attended to, move beyond intuition to the logic of the trade-off between honesty and broadcast efficiency,
Yeah.
right? So seeing someone use tools, that's something that you can see from a distance, right? In Indonesia, where there are many, many ethnic groups, where people wear their knife is an ethnic marker. Is it in the front, is it on the side, is it on the back, right? And how you handle it is an ethnic marker. So that has high broadcast efficiency. Is it completely honest? No, you can fake it.
Just put it over here.
You can move it around, right? But there's a
Yeah.
trade-off between those two things.
Yeah. Great.
So I was interested in some of the things from the other people's research where they didn't find the similarities, because some of them actually fall into this realm of ethnic markers, like the color things and the sticker. And the interesting thing about ethnic markers, like dress or things like that, right? So we know they work with adults, right? Because there are those studies where they just randomly assign people to like Team Blue or Team Red, and then they start to act coalitionally.
Even like a 5-year-old will do
right.
something like that.
So I mean, I think that's an interesting question about when these things come online. But yeah, it does seem somewhat arbitrary why some of these work and some of them wouldn't, because a lot of ethnic, like the fact that the stickers were assigned to them, for example, right? Well, lots of ethnic markers are assigned to you as a child. Like you don't particularly choose the way that you're going to dress and things like that, or how you're going to wear your hair.
But maybe
Those
you
things
need
are
more
based
like
upon-
long-lasting exposure. So if you always are supposed to wear this or always wear this, at least when you do X thing, like you always wear a kippah, you go into the synagogue, then you can like learn that has that signal value.
Right, but then I think that's plausible. It'd be interesting to try to figure out why some of them, like food preference, you get this instantaneous response, right? And then other things, you need to see it repeatedly to understand that it's not random. And whether that's something, I mean, we happen to be in a culture where dress and things like that are not very heterogeneous in terms of like the color of my shirt doesn't mean anything, right? Whereas the color of the cloth that a Maasai person wears is red, right? And it's and so there's because there's less uniformity out in the world that those infants are looking at, maybe those aren't as
Right. So maybe
markers.
maybe even earlier on, if you were somewhere where that had, even in only the few months of the infant's life, marked something that was important that they could track, they might be able to use it. Whereas babies in America don't see puppets wearing mittens ever, aren't really wearing mittens themselves usually. Orange and yellow are fairly similar, so it's like, yeah,
Right.
so it's basically like there's two extremes, right? Like language seems pretty good in its signal value, and there's a lot of evidence that even newborn infants are attending to it. And so it makes sense that they could use it in this way. So it's like kind of on one extreme of like a lot of good signal value, and then like randomly assigned mitten that you've never seen anyone wear mittens before that vary not in any kind of substantial way, sort of like the most minimal, and so there's like probably some kind of continuum, and maybe like you can get anywhere on it, but with different amounts of experience. So just like being born and having like heard language throughout the time that you were developing is like enough experience. And like the mittens you would need, you know, if like for the next month of your life, like you did this study as like a pre-test, and then the babies went home and everyone in the family wore yellow mittens, and like they watched videos of like people being mean wearing orange mittens or something like that, and then they came back to the lab a month later, maybe they would use mittens, right? Like so there's clearly some learning process that's happening. How fast it is or what it picks up on, I mean, are I think important questions, but.
This reminds me so much of, I think it's John Leda, and it's either Kurzban or Kuczynski that like can erase that one.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, It seems like what you have here is you're looking at a system for tracking coalitional badges. And sort of like what you were saying, if you give infants information that says this cue, whatever it is going to imply something about who's friends with who argues with who, and all of that. That's what you're getting at. And I guess I'm wondering why you didn't frame it that way.
Yeah.
Just
I mean, I
instead
think
of just
that's right.
similarity. Because there's similarity, and then there are things that imply something about the social structure. And it seems like that's what's more important.
Right. Well, coalitions are one kind of social group, and then some of these are like smaller boundaries. Like within a coalition, you're friends with some. So, yeah, coalition probably is similar to how I was talking about national group membership or some kind of group membership that's about who we are, right? And so that's one type of relationship that some kinds of similarity might matter for. But I do think it's directly relevant to those papers that you're talking about can race be erased. Because basically the hypothesis is that there's something in the mind of a baby that's looking at least for some kinds of similarity, and which ones those are probably changes based on the input that the system gets. So if you grow up in a culture, so right, even young kids do show attention to race not as much as they do to gender, which is in line with that can race be erased argument. And you can disrupt it a lot more easily, just like you can with adults, so that same kind of thing. But babies don't show that like a social preference based on race at all, right? So it's kind of like they've learned it in the US because of the experience seeing that race marks coalition, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I'm kind of, it is in that light asking which cues our babies are attending to as marking different kinds of coalitions or other relationships more broadly.
And if I can ask a follow-up question, when you had that thing where it was like the little girl at the top and then this is her sister, schoolmate and everything, where I thought you were going with that is I noticed that the girl on the top and the blonde girl on this side both had the same haircut. But one was blonde and one had brown hair. And the girl on the other side had a similar hair color to the one on top. And I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, in the future, looking at what cues infants are using to infer, like, quote-unquote type. I'm thinking about that old research, I think it's with Gelman, with, essentially you see like it's like the bird and the plane and the bat.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? So is it just, which cues do you think when people look
Right,
at
so I mean, those are all perceptual cues. So in our study, I mean, I just showed you one example,
Yeah.
right? But half the time it was the other way. So half the time so we counterbalance that. You could look at whether there's item effects,
Yeah.
right? So is it easier to make the inference when, you know, the one who has the same haircut is the one who's listed as the sibling? Oh, they look, you know, they look alike, so blah, blah, blah.
Oh, yeah, no, I meant, is that where you're going future, do you have any intention to go there future research? I don't think, I trust that you counterbalance and everything,
Right.
that wasn't what I was saying.
No, yeah, I just mean, I'm probably not going to look at those exact cues. I am interested in different kinds of cues, but maybe some would be perceptual, like something like race. I don't know exactly where an inference that haircut would be super meaningful. I'm probably not going to study that exact one, but I think the general idea is interesting, right?
Yeah.
So which kinds of cues might be most likely to mark different kinds of relationships and then earlier. So are there some that are easier to pick up on, like skin color?
Yeah, well, so, you know, so in Thailand, for instance, there's an age period where the girls all have their hair cut really short. So that's like, you know, it could signify something in the same way that a lot of these things could signify or could not signify something more meaningful. Thanks, cool thought.
Yeah.
So this is something we were talking about earlier, and I'd love to talk about it more, and it particularly relates to this previous question, which is that some markers are easier for babies to attend to than others. And so things like race, for example, babies learn, it's very hard for babies to see and perceive race, and it's totally constructed depending on where you're living and what time you're living in. Mm-hmm. But something like language is much more evolutionarily developed. We haven't developed anything that teaches us race in our brains. I mean, we have the processes.
Which is what that
mechanisms
paper talks about.
Yeah. So I thought when we met earlier, you actually gave me this really brilliant explanation for language and why language might be something that babies attend to very, very early on as a marker of difference. And I'd love for you to just sort of talk
Go
about
back
that.
to it, yeah.
One other thing is I'd love for you to also talk a bit about the role of emotions here, because people are sort of hinting around it. You know, you feel like this is different, you feel like this is more similar to you, and those emotions I think are really important for how people experience salient difference.
Yeah, so I'll start with that because now it's like fresh, and then I'll go back. So in terms of the emotional stuff, there actually is an interesting thing going on here. So some of you may have noticed that in all of the studies, basically these two people are like sitting at the table together, and they're like watching each other do stuff. And so it sort of like really looks like agreement. Like if I say I like something, and you're watching me say that I really like it, and then you go on to immediately disagree and say that you don't like it, there's sort of this like strong tension, right? That's rude, and maybe particularly rude in the context of food, but it might just generally be rude. And so the people who do the studies that I was talking about with the puppet choice of liking the one who was similar to you, argue that this kind of thing is based on agreement and disagreement. So the relevant property is that the baby did something, and then the puppet either agrees or disagrees right in front of the baby. And if you disagree, that's rude, and I don't like you. And so that's a different argument than similarity in and of itself mattering. Right? And I don't think that there's necessarily the best evidence for this yet. I've tried to get at it by presenting in a version of my studies where the people are separate from each other. So they see like videos of person A liking one food without person B there, and then separately videos of person B. And if it really is about similarity, then you should find the same exact effect because they still are similar to each other. Whereas if it's about disagreement, if they aren't together and they don't necessarily know what the other person is doing or saying, then you wouldn't expect to find the effect. We found like an age difference where 6-month-olds need people to be together in order to show the effect, and 14-month-olds don't. So it's sort of hard to say what's developing. What could be developing is a new notion of how this similarity works, so that your preferences stay with you over time. What's probably more likely to be developing is something like memory, like a domain general system for tracking that the two people over time, even though they weren't presented together, were doing something. So I can't say exactly what's going on there, but there are a lot of questions about is this really about some kind of like emotional thing, like you're being nice to me and we're agreeing and we're in this together, or is it about something more of like a stable trait of a person? All right, and then back to, we're talking about language, right, and sort of why it's maybe particularly important. So I do think that language is different than other things, and one way that it's different than other things, which we were talking about a little bit here too, is that babies can start to hear before they're even born. So you could imagine different kinds of systems. Like one reason that babies could attend to language as an interesting feature of social identity when they're born is just because there's some like built-in system in the head that says attend to language, it's relevant. But what could also be going on is maybe this is actually something that's been developing too, which has been developing before babies were even born and in the first few hours or days or months of life, right? So if you've been hearing your native language all around you, then you have experience that already is familiar, that kind of thing matters, and so even hours after birth, babies prefer languages that are their native languages or that are in the same class as those in terms of prosody and pitch and all of those kinds of things. And so maybe maybe language is like really special in this way, or maybe it actually is just something that is experience expectant. You don't know which language it is that you're going to hear when you're out or when you're 7 months gestation, but you are hearing one, and that experience is already cueing you to pay attention to this feature that might be relevant. And so food preferences might kind of work like that too. You don't know what foods you're going to eat when you come out, but you're going to eat some foods, you're going to watch people eating other foods, and use that as like a learning tool that happens really early, whereas other kinds of features of people or similarity might not be relevant to a baby. So, yeah.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, so you mentioned a potential mechanism is that they see things together as they develop. So is it possible to see if in families where everyone eats the same thing, the kids are more likely to identify, or even better with the language example, in families where everyone speaks the same, maybe the kids are more attuned to different people with differences, but in families like in my family, for example, I speak to my baby one language, but his sibling speaks to him in English. So in families where you have multiple languages being spoken at the baby, are they then less surprised that people who speak different language are friends?
Yes, I've actually done a version of that. So we had babies who are from multilingual families come into the lab, and it was the question about do they generalize the food preferences across people. So babies who are from monolingual homes think that if two people speak different languages, they probably won't like the same thing. But babies who are from multilingual homes actually showed the other effect, which is that they continue to generalize. So I do think that the way that food works is probably kind of like what you were talking about earlier. So the purpose of caring about what other people eat is that you're learning, right? Is this safe or not? Is this healthy or not? And so there's a couple pieces of evidence for that. One of them is that if you don't show any information about the relationship or the groups, babies tend to generalize food preferences. So if person A likes something, they think person B will like it. And what you're doing when monolingual babies see that people speak different languages is disrupting that normal, I've learned from A that it's good, so it also applies to B. But multilingual babies continue to generalize even if the people speak different languages. And also another piece of evidence for that is that in the realm of dislike, so if the first person actively dislikes the food rather than likes it, babies will generalize that dislike regardless of the social relationships, suggesting that they've maybe learned this food is dangerous or bad. It doesn't matter if you're from a different place or not friends, you probably won't you probably shouldn't eat it either because maybe it's not good to eat. So there's some like general thing that infants might learn from watching other people eat. Is this okay or not okay? But then if it's okay, who is it okay for? And then their experience would be different and tell them that it's, either for everyone. My mom and dad speak different languages. They eat the same foods. These two people speak different languages. She likes it. She'll probably also like it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
In terms of behavioral outcomes, do you have any predictions or feelings about what and when these babies will use this information for? Like, is it just learn for X number of years because you're going to need to know it as an adult, it's just a lot? Or is it like, you need to know this now because it affects what you do to be a successful 2-year-old?
Yeah, so I think babies are using it now. So, for example, the fact that they would want to take a toy from somebody who speaks their native language over somebody who speaks a foreign language, or that they would be more likely to learn a word from somebody who speaks their native language than a foreign language. Basically, you could imagine that one reason why we would have these systems at all is that you're looking for relevant teachers. So all sorts of people do things in all different kinds of ways, and so you might want to be figuring out who is a member of my group or my community and who's going to teach me the right stuff that I need to know. And so that's like a first-person inference that you would need. And that actually has like a lot more research behind it. And so what I was interested in was like, we know that babies are looking for people maybe that are familiar to their parents who might teach them stuff. Can they also use that information that they're using to guide their own learning to think about things like, how would two Spanish speakers interact, right? So those are two people. It's not really relevant for me, so I wouldn't need to know that in order to decide how I'm going to learn, but I could still use it to think about like how the world is structured, right? So and a desire to learn from an English speaker, if you're an English-speaking baby, is a useful thing. Maybe you would learn the kinds of things that are relevant in your community, but that's different from being able to think English speakers are a group who have these kinds of practices and interact in these ways. Even though I'm not in this group, that other group also has practices of their own and interact in their own kind of ways.
Could that mean that that a baby would find it surprising that two friends would disagree over whether food was good or not, because it's a complex signal of, if I want to ask for this food, I have to ask for it from this person. If I want that food, I have to ask for it from that person, which is a much more complex piece of information than the other kinds if they agreed or if they weren't friends.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It seems plausible to me. I don't know of any specific work that's on it, but I am interested in moving into this realm of like connecting these third-person ideas to first-person choices. So showing babies things like these food movies and then giving them a chance to eat the foods themselves and seeing if they differentially learn. So you can see, whether things like who's on the screen still would impact. Like if they have bowl A and B, and the person that's on the screen had liked A, are they more likely to kind of model that person or want to, be like, so things like that. I don't know the answer, but I think it's relevant. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speculate about the extension of this work to attachment theory. So you have the monometric hypothesis, which is that no matter what, the babies are going to orient to their mother, a single person, and then the polymatric or pluralist account, which is babies are quite capable of having more than one significant caretaker. And cultures provide, for in different cultures, privileged or preferred caregivers, and they're not only the mother, it could be siblings or other people. And there's a sensitive period, after around 10 months or so, there's an onset, and then there's a resolution during the time frame of your ages of your kids. So is it speculatively true that what you're showing is that pairing friendship and affiliative cues with food shows that these babies would orient to more than one person, indeed several persons, if they in fact are repeatedly presented with that, and that shows that the possibility exists that that's how babies are orienting toward privileged or sensitive caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I don't have any data on it, but people have looked at things like in the first-person domain, like how infants make choices, right? And so infants are more likely to choose to interact with objects or foods that their mom has interacted with than a stranger, right? So that's like a thing that we know. But they're also more likely to interact with an object that somebody who's like them has liked than somebody who's, from a different kind of group. And so you could ask about individual differences and how open infants are to do this. So right now it kind of like looks like maybe there's a typical trajectory, which is like my mom is the best, then other people who are sort of like my mom or like my group, and then, strangers, and then like bad people. Don't learn from bad people. And so you could ask whether in different kinds of cultures with different parenting structures, there's just more general openness in terms of word learning or object choice. I imagine you would find that because a lot of what's happening is probably integrating experiences of like who's cared for me in the past and how broad is that network, and then thinking about then sort of the world of possible partners and learning. And it's very different in the US where you typically have like one or two primary caregivers than other kind of allo-parenting societies. So I'm sure those babies are different. One way in which we know they're different is in terms of how word learning works. So like babies in Yucatan villages in Mayan Mexico aren't like are around these much bigger family structures and mostly spend time with like older siblings rather than parents and learn through overheard and observation stuff and not in the same kind of direct pedagogical way. And they still learn language. So they might be doing it in like a different route. They don't get, you might think like, oh, we teach babies language by putting them in front of us and being like, cup. But you can get there in a lot of different ways. And so they might be looking for different cues of relevant features.
Yeah. So when you're looking at similarities to infer a relationship and then thinking about the cost of making a mistake, like let's say you would expect them to be friends but they're actually enemies, or if you expect them to be enemies but they're actually friends, from an evolutionary perspective, like do you think the system would be designed to try to avoid one of those more because it's more costly mistake? And I'm just thinking about your first two graphs where I think the one with like the blue one was way higher and you're like, oh, like it looks even more significant. Do you think that could be something?
Yeah, so there's two interpretations for that. So the finding was basically like they expect people who are similar to be friends, but they maybe really expect people who are dissimilar to not be friends. And you could think that's because, if you think two people aren't going to be friends, you might like avoid that being with those people if it's going to cause a conflict or something, right? And so that should be really important. Whereas if you think two people, like if you make the mistake in the other direction, like maybe it's not as bad. Like you thought two people weren't going to be friends, so you avoided it, but they were fine together. Like you didn't lose out on anything by like not approaching that situation, right? So maybe that could explain the difference. I think actually what explains the difference is something lower level and not as interesting, which is that babies like the waving movies. So we don't have any like baseline data where they don't see any similarity, and then we show them the test trials, which you would need because basically here, like they look long, like attention is just measured at how long they're looking at the screen. And I'm pretty sure that what's happening is that when the people are waving at each other, the babies are looking at the screen and waving back. And that leads to generally longer looking times. And so when the pattern is supposed to be that they look longer at that, the effect looks really big. And when it's supposed to be that they have to override that fact that they really like watching people wave at each other and waving, the effect looks smaller. So I think there could be interesting things. That's sort of why I've moved to the opposite direction of showing those first, and then you can show test trials that like look more similar. But I think it's of course you'd want to think about why do we have these kinds of things, and if some mistakes are more important than others, then you would expect these differences to emerge, but the actual differences, I think, are just due to the stimuli. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about similarity of social preferences themselves. So if two people share the same enemy, do you think babies are likely to infer that those two people are friends, or if they share the same friend, are they more likely to perceive a friendship, or do they, I mean, how complex does it go? Is the enemy of my friend also my enemy? And I'm wondering if you or others have thought about that.
Yeah, that was actually my senior thesis from undergrad, which is now under review, you guys, over 10 years later, it's under review. But basically what we did was that we had babies see one person who was similar to themselves and one who was different, and then one of those was they were randomly assigned to see one of them. And so they saw that character be nice to somebody and not nice to somebody else. So basically, similar person has a friend and has a non-friend, and then babies got to pick between them. And so when it was the similar puppet, babies picked to interact with the one that person liked, so the friend of a friend. So they trusted sort of the social judgment of that character to inform their own choice of who to interact with. But when it was the dissimilar puppet, so the dissimilar puppet has a friend and has a non-friend, then babies were at chance. So it wasn't that they liked the enemy of my enemy, they just didn't think that person, or what we say is like, they didn't think that person's information was like relevant to pay attention to. Like, that person's not like me, they have their associates and not, but like, whatever. And so, yeah, I'm interested in those kinds of questions in general, but that's preliminary evidence. Yeah.
So I want to, both in light of what you just said and in light of what was said earlier, I want to back up to an issue, which is that coalition and co-ethny are being used as synonymous, in part in your own remarks and in part by Discussant's remarks, and those are not synonymous. So a coalition is a group of individuals who act together for a common goal. Right? An ethnic group is a set of individuals who share cultural information, and that shared cultural information presents an affordance for collective action and shared goals, but it need not be realized that way. Right? So the Kurzban et al. Erasing Race paper doesn't show that you can erase race. What it shows is that in making decisions about coalitions, people attend to salient coalitional cues, and that American undergraduates use race as a salient coalitional cue in the absence of other information. But in a couple of weeks, we're going to hear a talk from Christina Moya, who has quite compelling evidence that children are innate essentialists, that they essentialize the characteristics of adults and expect them to be passed on to their offspring, to their biological offspring, right? Which is a core component of race cognition. And that, in fact, it's quite hard to erase that. That culture has to work very, very hard to get people to not essentialize on the basis of those characteristics. Why would you essentialize? Well, if you think that cultural information predicts behavior, then essentialism is a good inductive heuristic. That is, I can predict the way that people will behave on the basis of cultural lineage, right? And essentialism is just a shortcut to get you there. That matters for this work because saying that two people will affiliate, right, is in some ways combining the two issues. That is, how similar will they be and how much will they act in concert with each other. But the issues are separable, and as you know, I know from your advisor's work and other people's work, right, in terms of predicting like whose preferences should I follow, right? That isn't about affiliation, that's about assuming what information is relevant. So I think moving forward in your research agenda, a useful guideline will be to differentiate between affiliation and shared knowledge, right? And so far you've combined them in very sensible and productive ways, right? But they aren't the same thing. So you can tell people these two individuals' interests are aligned, and you will expect them to act as a coalition as a consequence of that. Or you can tell people these two people share cultural information, and I can predict that they will behave similarly, even if their interests are not aligned. See what I mean? You understand that?
Yeah, I don't think that I've so far studied anything that is specific to a coalition. I do think it has relevant implications that maybe you could ask about actual cooperation. And in terms of the essentialism point, it's true that people essentialize, but that's also very dependent on experience. So like work by Kristen Pauker or Sarah Gaither, people who look at race shows, that different kinds of kids, so if you're multiracial, you're less likely to essentialize based on race, or if you grow up in a diverse community, so she's in Hawaii, for example, and they're less likely to essentialize by race, so.
Well, I encourage you to watch Christina Moya's talk, because she's got what I think is the most definitive evidence in this regard. And the evidence indicates, to foreshadow, that the kids start off being essentialists, and you gotta teach them not to when it's not relevant. That's their first pass. There's an open debate going on, but
Right.
I would encourage you to, pay attention to her work.
Okay. Yeah.
Since that was also partly directed at me, I just want to say, I don't think, and Zoe and I talked before, so I don't think, at least I wasn't saying it, I don't think she's saying that kids don't essentialize. They do, but what they're essentializing about and what markers they use to essentialize about differ. So what we call race in the United States is very different in other places in the world, and of course we have the cognitive mechanisms that lead us towards essentializing behaviors and perceptions. But we call it race here, and we presume that it has to do with skin color here. That's very different in other places of the world. So language might be one of those things that you use to form essentializing assumptions about other people, perhaps earlier on than you use skin color, because that has to be learned. You need to be socialized into seeing that as an essentializing marker of difference. And I don't know, but I suspect that language might be different partly because of hearing different sounds in utero. I just think it's interesting, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually do think the work on shared preferences, what we were going for was actually an essentialist thing. So I do think that's evidence of essentialism in infancy before they're even a year old. But in terms of whether they would do that based on all kinds of social groups like race, I'll watch her talk.
So this gets at the issue of broadcast efficiency that I talked about before, because one explanation for the salience of skin color is that it's just an evolutionarily novel super releaser for psychology that is attuned to adornment as a marker of shared cultural information. And there's another argument, which is that it's the proper domain is actually interspecific interaction, not interspecific interaction, but that's a different story. Well, I hate to get the last one.
I hope Christina Moya adequately integrates her spelled work. I look forward to it.
You won't be disappointed.
I will.
Okay, thank you so much, Zoe.